Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other park rangers at Yellowstone National Park. While her colleagues were known for their boisterous stories around the campfire and their eager interactions with tourists, Sarah preferred to blend into the background like the wildlife she protected. Her supervisor, Chief Ranger Williams, often joked that she moved through the forest like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without a sound. The morning of June 15th started like any other summer day in the park. Sarah arrived at the ranger station before dawn, her boots making soft impressions in the dewy grass as she made her way to check the overnight reports. The early morning air carried the familiar scents of pine and wildflowers, mixed with the distant aroma of campfire smoke from the nearby campgrounds. The first operative fell to Sarah's unconventional tactics just after midnight. She had positioned herself near the listening post overlooking the research station, knowing that someone would come to check on the equipment during the night shift change. When the operative arrived, Sarah was waiting in the shadows like the apex predator she had learned to become. Years of studying wolf behavior had taught her the value of patience and precise timing. She waited until the operative was fully engaged with checking his surveillance equipment before making her move. Using a technique learned from park maintenance work, she created a small avalanche of loose rocks that trapped the man's leg while she approached from behind. Before he could call for help or reach for his weapon, Sarah had secured him with zip ties from her emergency kit. The operative was unconscious from a carefully applied sleeper hold she had learned during ranger training for handling dangerous wildlife encounters. Sarah dragged him to a secure location and removed his communication equipment, ensuring he could not warn his colleagues when he eventually awakened. 1 down, 6 to go. The second target proved more challenging. Sarah had observed that one operative regularly patrolled the perimeter road in a modified ATV, checking on the various surveillance positions. She knew she had to time her approach perfectly to catch him between locations where he would be isolated and vulnerable. Sarah positioned herself at a narrow point in the trail where the ATV would be forced to slow down for a sharp turn. She had prepared the area by loosening several large rocks above the path, creating a natural trap that would appear to be a random rock slide. When the ATV's headlight appeared in the distance, Sarah triggered her makeshift avalanche. The rocks cascaded down the hillside, blocking the trail and forcing the operative to stop. As he dismounted to investigate, Sarah struck from the darkness above. Her years of climbing and rappelling experience allowed her to descend silently behind him. Another sleeper hold rendered him unconscious before he could react, and soon he joined his colleague in Sarah's improvised holding area. The third operative presented the greatest challenge yet. He was positioned in the cave system where Sarah had first discovered their base of operations, and he had the advantage of defensive terrain with multiple escape routes. Sarah would have to enter his territory and confront him on ground that he knew well. She approached the cave complex from the rear entrance she had discovered during her earlier escape. Moving through the narrow passages required absolute silence, as the slightest sound would echo through the cave system and alert her target. Sarah had learned to move like a mountain cat from her years of wildlife observation, placing each step carefully to avoid loose rocks or unstable surfaces. The operative was monitoring his surveillance equipment when Sarah emerged from the shadows behind him. This time, she could not rely on surprise alone, as he was trained to watch for threats from multiple directions. Sarah waited until he was focused on adjusting a camera position, then used a technique she had learned from studying how predators approach their prey. She moved in a direct line during his moments of distraction, freezing completely whenever he turned toward her direction. When she was close enough to strike, Sarah used her emergency whistle to create a sharp, disorienting sound that confused the operative's hearing while she closed the final distance. Before he could locate the source of the noise, she had applied the sleeper hold and secured another prisoner. The fourth and fifth operatives were working as a team, monitoring the main approach to the research facility from a concealed position in dense forest. Sarah knew that confronting two trained individuals simultaneously would be extremely dangerous, so she developed a strategy to separate them using their own procedures against them. Sarah had observed that the team used radio check-ins every 30 minutes, with specific call signs and responses. She had been listening to their communications using the equipment taken from the first operative, learning their protocols and voice patterns. When the next check-in was due, Sarah used the captured radio to send a false message requesting one of the team members to investigate a possible security breach at a distant location. As one operative left to investigate the false alarm, Sarah positioned herself to intercept him en route. She had chosen a location where the trail passed through a narrow ravine, using the natural geography to limit his options for escape or maneuver. When he arrived at the designated coordinates and found no evidence of a security breach, Sarah was already positioned above him on the rocky walls of the ravine. She used another rock slide technique to create confusion and disorientation, then rappelled down to confront the operative while he was dealing with the unexpected obstacle. The element of surprise combined with the difficult terrain allowed her to subdue him before he could effectively respond. The fifth operative became suspicious when his partner failed to return from the investigation. Sarah monitored his radio communications as he called for backup and reported a possible compromise of their operation. She realized that the remaining two operatives, including the team leader, would soon converge on her location. Rather than waiting for them to find her, Sarah decided to take the initiative. She used the captured radio equipment to send false messages suggesting that federal agents were approaching from multiple directions and that the operation had been blown. The psychological pressure of believing they were surrounded by superior forces would work in her favor. Sarah positioned herself near the operative's location and began using classic misdirection techniques. She threw rocks to create sounds of movement from different directions, used her emergency whistle to simulate tactical signals, and even used her vehicle's PA system from a remote location to broadcast official-sounding warnings about federal agents in the area. The operative's training worked against him in this situation. His instincts told him to establish defensive positions and wait for support, but the apparent presence of multiple threats from different directions created confusion about where to focus his attention. When Sarah finally approached from an unexpected angle, he was already disoriented and reactive rather than proactive. She used the same combination of stealth and surprise that had worked with the previous targets, approaching during his moments of distraction and applying the sleeper hold before he could mount an effective defense. 5 operatives were now secured, leaving only the team leader and one additional operative. The 6th operative was the team's communications specialist, responsible for maintaining contact with their outside support network. Sarah had saved him for near the end, because she needed to ensure that no external warnings were sent before she completed her mission. She had been monitoring his position at the main communication post, waiting for the right moment to approach. This operative was the most cautious of the group, maintaining constant vigilance and regular radio checks with the team leader. Sarah realized that she could not use the same tactics that had worked with the others. Instead, she decided to use the operative's own caution against him. Sarah created a series of false alarms around the perimeter of his position, using techniques that made it appear that multiple individuals were attempting to approach from different directions. Each time the operative investigated one of these apparent threats, Sarah moved closer to his central position. She was essentially using the same herding techniques that wolves use to guide prey into vulnerable positions. When the operative finally realized that the threats were false and that he was being manipulated, Sarah was already in position to strike. She had learned the timing of his movement patterns and positioned herself along his most likely retreat route. As he attempted to return to his communication equipment to warn the team leader, Sarah intercepted him and applied the same subdual techniques that had worked throughout the night. The team leader was the most dangerous opponent Sarah had faced. He was experienced, well-trained, and now aware that his entire operation had been compromised. He had established a defensive position in elevated terrain with clear fields of fire in all directions. Approaching him would require all of Sarah's skills and knowledge. Sarah spent an hour studying his position and behavior patterns. The team leader was following standard defensive procedures, but he was also showing signs of stress and impatience as he lost contact with his operatives one by one. She realized that his military training, while making him more dangerous, also made his responses more predictable. The key to defeating him lay in understanding that he was thinking like a soldier defending against an organized attack, while Sarah was actually operating like a predator hunting isolated prey. She used this difference in perspective to develop an approach that would be unexpected from his military frame of reference. Sarah created the impression that she was coordinating with a larger force by using multiple radio frequencies to broadcast contradictory orders and position reports. She made it appear that federal agents were surrounding his position and preparing for a coordinated assault. The psychological pressure of believing he was facing overwhelming odds began to affect his decision-making. When the team leader finally attempted to escape his position and retreat to a secondary location, Sarah was waiting along his most likely escape route. She had anticipated his movement based on standard military doctrine and her knowledge of the local terrain. The final confrontation lasted only minutes, with Sarah using the same combination of surprise, terrain advantage, and specialized techniques that had served her throughout the night. As dawn broke over Yellowstone National Park, Sarah stood among 7 unconscious operatives secured in a natural depression that served as an improvised holding area. She had successfully neutralized an entire surveillance team using nothing but her knowledge of the wilderness, her ranger training, and her understanding of predator and prey behavior. The aftermath moved quickly once Sarah was able to contact federal authorities through secure channels. FBI agents and Park Service investigators descended on the scene, discovering evidence of a sophisticated corporate espionage operation designed to steal valuable research data and intimidate scientists working on endangered species protection. The investigation revealed that the operatives had been hired by a coalition of mining and development companies seeking to undermine environmental protection efforts. Their plan had included kidnapping key researchers and destroying years of scientific data that supported federal protection of critical habitats. Dr. Thompson and her research team returned to find their work intact and their safety assured. The captured operatives provided evidence that led to the prosecution of the corporate executives who had funded the operation. Sarah's careful documentation and evidence gathering ensured that the legal case was ironclad. Chief Williams recommended Sarah for commendation, noting that her quick thinking and unusual tactics had prevented what could have been a serious terrorist incident against federal researchers. The story spread throughout the Park Service as an example of how individual initiative and specialized knowledge could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Sarah returned to her regular duties with a new appreciation for the complexity of protecting America's natural resources. She had learned that threats to the wilderness could come from unexpected sources and that the skills she had developed for protecting wildlife could also be used to protect the people who dedicated their lives to conservation work. The quiet ranger who had always preferred to work in the shadows had proven that sometimes staying silent until the moment for action arrives is the most effective approach. Her colleagues still joked about her ghost-like movements through the forest, but now they understood that those same skills had made her one of the most effective law enforcement officers in the National Park Service. Years later, Sarah continued her work protecting Yellowstone's wildlife and visitors, carrying the knowledge that she had successfully faced the ultimate test of her abilities and training. She had remained quiet with the Rangers until the moment came to take decisive action, and when that moment arrived, she had proven more than capable of protecting everything she held dear. As she reviewed the incident, Sarah arrived at work the next morning with a carefully constructed plan. She had spent most of the night researching the legal boundaries of her authority as a federal ranger and studying detailed topographical maps of the park. Her years of training had included courses on surveillance detection and counter-surveillance techniques, knowledge she had never expected to use in protecting wildlife. The morning briefing proceeded normally, with Chief Williams discussing routine patrol assignments and reminding everyone about the upcoming visit from a congressional delegation. Sarah volunteered for the remote monitoring duties, knowing this would give her legitimate reasons to be in areas where the surveillance team might relocate. Her first stop was the research station, where she found Dr. Thompson and her team preparing for their weekly data collection expedition. Sarah approached the conversation casually, asking about any unusual observations or equipment malfunctions. Dr. Thompson mentioned that several of their remote cameras had been showing unusual activity patterns, with images that suggested someone had been tampering with the devices. This confirmation of Sarah's suspicions added urgency to her mission. The surveillance team was not only watching the researchers, but actively interfering with their scientific work. Sarah realized that the situation was escalating faster than she had anticipated, and she needed to identify all members of the group before taking action. Throughout the morning, Sarah used her official duties as cover for a systematic search of potential surveillance locations. Her knowledge of the park's geography allowed her to predict where observers might position themselves for optimal coverage of the research activities. She discovered evidence of recent human presence at 3 different locations, each carefully chosen to provide unobstructed views of sensitive areas. At the second location, hidden in a grove of ancient pines overlooking the main research trail, Sarah found something that made her heart race. Buried under a pile of dead leaves was a sophisticated listening device, still active and transmitting to an unknown receiver. The device was military-grade equipment, far beyond the resources of typical corporate espionage operations. Sarah carefully photographed the device without disturbing it, then used her emergency GPS unit to record the exact coordinates. She was building a case that would require precise documentation to convince federal authorities of the threat level. As she worked, she noticed fresh boot prints leading away from the device location toward a rocky ridge that overlooked the entire research facility. Following the trail required all of Sarah's tracking skills. The surveillance team had attempted to mask their movements, but years of following wildlife had taught her to read the subtle signs that most people missed. A scuffed rock here, a bent blade of grass there, the almost imperceptible impression of a boot's sole in hard-packed earth. The trail led to a natural cave formation that provided perfect concealment for long-term observation. Inside the cave, Sarah discovered the extent of the surveillance operation. Professional-grade cameras with powerful telephoto lenses were positioned to monitor every entrance to the research facility. Computer equipment hummed quietly in the darkness, powered by portable generators and connected to satellite communication gear. Most disturbing were the detailed files scattered across a makeshift desk. Photographs of every researcher, complete with personal information including home addresses and family details. Schedules of their activities, maps marking their usual routes, and what appeared to be psychological profiles assessing their potential vulnerabilities. Sarah realized she was looking at the preparation for something much more serious than corporate espionage. The level of detail suggested planning for kidnapping, intimidation, or worse. The research team was in immediate danger, and she was the only person who knew about the threat. As she photographed the evidence with her phone, Sarah heard voices approaching the cave entrance. The surveillance team was returning, and she was trapped in their base of operations with no means of escape except through the main entrance. Her heart pounded as she quickly gathered her equipment and looked for alternative exit routes. The cave system was more extensive than it had appeared from the entrance. Sarah discovered a narrow passage leading deeper into the rock formation, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She had no choice but to trust that it would lead to another exit, as the voices outside were getting closer. The passage wound through the rock for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah's ranger training in cave rescue techniques helped her navigate the tight spaces without panic, even as she heard the surveillance team members entering the main cave chamber behind her. She emerged from a hidden exit nearly 50 yards away, concealed by thick brush and rocky outcroppings. From this position, she could observe the cave entrance and count the members of the surveillance team as they worked. What she discovered changed everything she thought she knew about the operation. 7 individuals were now involved in the surveillance activities, far more than the 3 she had initially observed. They moved with military precision and discipline, suggesting professional training and possibly active or former military service. Their equipment was state-of-the-art, including night vision devices, encrypted communication systems, and what appeared to be weapons concealed in equipment cases. Sarah watched as the team leader, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes, briefed the group on their next phase of operations. Although she could not hear the details, their body language and the way they pointed toward different locations suggested they were planning coordinated actions against multiple targets. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The surveillance team was not just watching the researchers, they were preparing to neutralize them. The detailed personal files, the mapping of security systems, and the military-style organization all pointed to a planned attack on the research facility and its personnel. Sarah knew she had to act immediately, but she also recognized that she was severely outmanned and outgunned. 7 trained operatives with professional equipment and weapons were more than any single park ranger could handle through direct confrontation. She needed to use her knowledge of the terrain and her skills in wilderness survival to level the playing field. Her first priority was protecting the research team. Sarah carefully made her way back toward the facility, staying well clear of known surveillance positions. She needed to warn Dr. Thompson and her colleagues without alerting the surveillance team that their operation had been discovered. At the research station, Sarah found Dr. Thompson working alone in the main laboratory. She quickly explained the situation, showing the photographs she had taken as evidence. Dr. Thompson's face went pale as she realized the extent of the danger her team was facing. Together, they developed a plan to evacuate the research personnel without triggering a violent response from the surveillance team. The researchers would leave in small groups over the course of several hours, using different routes and maintaining normal radio communications to avoid suspicion. Dr. Thompson would coordinate with park headquarters to arrange for law enforcement backup. As the evacuation began, Sarah returned to the wilderness to monitor the surveillance team's activities. She needed to ensure that the researchers could escape safely while gathering additional evidence for federal investigators. What she discovered during her next observation session revealed the true scope of the threat. The surveillance team had expanded their operation to include monitoring of park ranger communications and movements. They had equipment capable of intercepting radio transmissions and tracking vehicle movements throughout the park. Sarah realized that her own activities were probably being monitored, and that calling for backup through normal channels would alert the operatives to the countermeasures being taken. The situation required a complete change in tactics. Sarah could not rely on backup or support from her colleagues. She was alone in the wilderness, facing 7 trained operatives who had demonstrated willingness to use violence to achieve their objectives. The research team's safety depended on her ability to neutralize the threat before the operatives realized their cover had been blown. Sarah spent the remaining daylight hours conducting reconnaissance of all known surveillance positions and identifying the patrol patterns of the operative teams. She discovered that they had divided into 3 groups, 2 teams of 2 operatives each, and 1 team of 3 led by the apparent leader. Each group was responsible for monitoring different aspects of the research facility and its approaches. As darkness fell, Sarah prepared for the most challenging night of her career. She had identified the locations where each group would be positioned, and she had developed a plan to neutralize them systematically using her knowledge of the terrain and her skills in wilderness survival. It would be dangerous, requiring her to move silently through enemy territory and confront trained operatives without backup or support. The stakes could not be higher. If she failed, the research team would return to face kidnapping or worse, and vital scientific work protecting endangered species would be lost. If she succeeded, she would have prevented a serious crime while protecting both human lives and the natural resources she had sworn to defend. Sarah checked her equipment one final time: emergency radio, GPS unit, first aid kit, and the standard ranger's sidearm that she had never hoped to use against human threats. She was about to begin a hunt where she was both the hunter and the hunted, using skills learned from years of tracking wildlife to protect everything she cared about most. Ts from the night shift, nothing seemed particularly unusual. A few noise complaints from campers, 1 minor bear sighting near the visitor center, and a report of suspicious vehicles seen near the restricted research area. Sarah's eyes lingered on that last report. The restricted area housed sensitive wildlife monitoring equipment and contained several endangered species habitats that were off-limits to the public. Her radio crackled to life as Ranger Johnson's voice filled the quiet station. He was reporting from the morning patrol, describing unusual tire tracks near the northern boundary of the park. The tracks appeared fresh, made sometime during the night, and they led directly toward the restricted zone. Sarah grabbed her gear and headed out to investigate, her instincts telling her that this was more than just lost tourists. The drive to the northern sector took 30 minutes through winding mountain roads. Sarah's pickup truck navigated the familiar terrain effortlessly as she mentally cataloged everything she knew about the restricted area. It contained the park's most valuable research on wolf reintroduction programs, rare bird nesting sites, and several underground caves that served as hibernation spots for protected bat species. When she arrived at the coordinates Johnson had provided, Sarah immediately noticed something was wrong. The tire tracks were too deliberate, too purposeful to belong to confused visitors. They showed clear evidence of multiple vehicles, and the tread patterns suggested heavy-duty trucks rather than typical tourist vehicles. More concerning was the fact that someone had attempted to cover the tracks with branches and loose soil. Sarah parked her truck a safe distance away and continued on foot. Her years of experience in the wilderness had taught her to move silently, a skill that had served her well during countless wildlife observations. As she followed the trail deeper into the forest, she began to notice other signs of human presence. Broken branches at specific heights, disturbed ground cover, and small pieces of equipment that had been carelessly dropped. The trail led to a clearing about 2 miles from the main road, hidden from casual view by dense forest and rocky outcroppings. What Sarah discovered there made her blood run cold. A sophisticated camping setup had been established, complete with camouflage tents, communication equipment, and what appeared to be surveillance gear pointed toward the research station. She crouched behind a large boulder and observed the scene carefully. 3 men moved around the campsite with military precision, checking equipment and studying detailed maps of the park. Their clothing was civilian, but their movements and organization suggested professional training. One man was speaking quietly into a satellite phone, while another adjusted what looked like a high-powered camera with a telephoto lens. Sarah realized she was witnessing something far more serious than typical poaching or vandalism. These individuals had established a professional surveillance operation in one of the most protected areas of the national park. The question was what they were watching and why they had chosen this particular location. She spent the next 2 hours observing their activities, taking careful mental notes of their routines, equipment, and apparent objectives. The men seemed to be monitoring the research station's activities, photographing everyone who entered and left the facility. They had detailed schedules and maps that suggested they had been planning this operation for weeks or possibly months. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed movement from the direction of the research station. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the lead wildlife biologist, was making her regular rounds to check the monitoring equipment scattered throughout the forest. Sarah watched in growing alarm as one of the surveillance team raised his camera to photograph the scientist's every movement. The pieces of the puzzle began forming in Sarah's mind. The research station was conducting groundbreaking work on endangered species protection, work that had significant economic and political implications. Several mining companies had been fighting legal battles to gain access to areas near the park, claiming that environmental protections were unnecessarily restrictive. The surveillance team could be gathering intelligence for corporate interests or even more sinister purposes. Sarah knew she had to gather more information before alerting her superiors. Making accusations without solid evidence could jeopardize any investigation and potentially put the research team at risk. She decided to maintain her position and continue observing, using her radio only for routine check-ins to avoid suspicion. As the day wore on, the surveillance team's activities became more concerning. They began deploying what appeared to be listening devices near the research station, and one team member started mapping the locations of security cameras and motion sensors. Their behavior suggested they were preparing for something more than passive observation. The sun was beginning to set when Sarah noticed a 4th person approaching the campsite. This individual was different from the others, dressed in expensive outdoor gear and carrying himself with an air of authority. The 3 surveillance team members immediately gathered around him for what appeared to be a briefing session. Sarah strained to hear their conversation, but they were too far away and speaking in hushed tones. However, their body language and the way they pointed toward various locations around the park told her that plans were being made. The newcomer handed out what looked like additional equipment and maps before departing the way he had come. As darkness fell, Sarah faced a difficult decision. She could return to the ranger station and report what she had seen, but that would mean losing visual contact with the surveillance team. Alternatively, She could remain in position overnight and gather more intelligence, but that would put her in potential danger if she were discovered. The decision was made for her when she noticed the team beginning to pack up some of their equipment. They appeared to be preparing to move to a new location, possibly closer to the research station. Sarah realized that whatever they were planning was about to escalate, and she might be the only person in a position to prevent it. She quietly retreated to her truck and drove back toward the ranger station, her mind racing with the implications of what she had witnessed. The surveillance operation was too sophisticated and well-funded to be the work of casual criminals. Someone with significant resources was very interested in the research being conducted at Yellowstone, and they were willing to break federal laws to obtain that information. Back at the station, Sarah sat in her truck for several minutes, considering her options. She could file an official report, but that would trigger a large-scale response that might spook the surveillance team before their true intentions could be determined. She could also contact federal authorities directly, but without concrete evidence of criminal activity, her report might be dismissed. Sarah decided on a third option. She would continue monitoring the situation on her own, gathering the evidence needed to build a solid case while preventing any harm to the research team or the park's protected wildlife. It was a risky decision, but her years of experience and intimate knowledge of the park's terrain gave her advantages that outside investigators would lack. As she prepared to return home for the night, Sarah noticed unusual vehicle lights moving along the park's perimeter roads. The surveillance team was already repositioning, just as she had suspected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Sarah knew she would need to be even more careful to avoid detection while gathering the evidence needed to protect everything she had dedicated her career to defending.